The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 16. In the course of another fortnight, I had seen sufficient of Frances Evans-Henri to enable me to form a more definite opinion of her character. I found her possessed in a somewhat remarkable degree of at least two good points, perseverance and a sense of duty. I found she was really capable of applying to study, of contending with difficulties. At first I offered her the same help which I had always found it necessary to confer on the others. I began with unloosing for her each knotty point, but I soon discovered that such help was regarded by my new pupil as degrading. She recoiled from it with a certain proud impatience. Hereupon I appointed her long lessons, and left her to solve alone any perplexities they might present. She set to the task with serious ardour, and, having quickly accomplished one labour, eagerly demanded more. So much for her perseverance. As to her sense of duty, it evinced itself thus. She liked to learn, but hated to teach. Her progress as a pupil depended upon herself, and I saw that on herself she could calculate with certainty. Her success as a teacher rested partly, perhaps chiefly, upon the will of others. It cost her a most painful effort to enter into conflict with this foreign will, to endeavour to bend it into subjection to her own, for in what regarded people, in general, the action of her will was impeded by many scruples. It was as unembarrassed, as strong where her own affairs were concerned, and to it she could at any time subject her inclination. If that inclination went counter to her convictions of right, yet, when called upon to wrestle with the propensities, the habits, the faults of others, of children especially, who are deaf to reason and, for the most part, insensate to persuasion, her will sometimes almost refused to act. Then came in the sense of duty, and forced the reluctant will into operation. A wasteful expense of energy and labour was frequently the consequence. Frances toiled for and with her pupils like a drudge, but it was long ere her conscientious exertions were rewarded by anything like docility on their part, because they saw that they had power over her, inasmuch as by resisting her painful attempts to convince, persuade, control, by forcing her to the employment of coercive measures, they could inflict upon her exquisite suffering. Human beings, human children especially, seldom deny themselves the pleasure of exercising a power which they are conscious of possessing, even though that power consists only in a capacity to make others wretched. A pupil whose sensations are duller than those of his instructor, while his nerves are tougher and his bodily strength perhaps greater, has an immense advantage over that instructor, and he will generally use it relentlessly, because the very young, very healthy, very thoughtless, know neither how to sympathize nor how to spare. Frances, I fear, suffered much. A continual weight seemed to oppress her spirits. I have said she did not live in the house, and whether in her own abode, wherever that might be, she wore the same preoccupied, unsmiling, sorrowfully resolved air that always shaded her features under the roof of Mademoiselle Roetier, I could not tell. One day I gave as a devoir the trite little anecdote of Alfred tending cakes in the herdsman's hut, to be related with amplifications. A singular affair most of the pupils made of it. Brevity was what they had chiefly studied. The majority of the narratives were perfectly unintelligible. Those of Sylvie and Léonie Ledru alone pretended to anything like sense and connection. Eulalie, indeed, had hit upon a clever expedient for at once ensuring accuracy and saving trouble. She had obtained access somehow to an abridged history of England, and had copied the anecdote out fair. I wrote on the margin of her production, "stupid and deceitful," and then tore it down the middle. Last in the pile of single-leaved devoirs I found one of several sheets, neatly written out and stitched together. I knew the hand, and scarcely needed the evidence of the signature, Frances Evans-Henri, to confirm my conjecture as to the writer's identity. Night was my usual time for correcting devoirs, and my own room the usual scene of such task most onerous hitherto, and it seemed strange to me to feel rising within me an incipient sense of interest as I snuffed the candle and addressed myself to the perusal of the poor teacher's manuscript. Now, thought I shall see a glimpse of what she really is. I shall get an idea of the nature and extent of her powers, not that she can be expected to express herself well in a foreign tongue, but still, if she has any mind, here will be a reflection of it. The narrative commenced by a description of a Saxon peasant's hut situated within the confines of a great, leafless winter forest. It represented an evening in December. Flakes of snow were falling, and the herdsman foretold a heavy storm. He summoned his wife to aid him in collecting their flock, roaming far away on the pastoral banks of the Thone. He warns her that it will be late ere they return. The good woman is reluctant to quit her occupation of baking cakes for the evening meal, but, acknowledging the primary importance of securing the herds and flocks, she puts on her sheepskin mantle, and, addressing a stranger who rests half reclined on a bed of rushes near the hearth, bids him mind the bread till her return. "Take care, young man," she continues, "that you fasten the door well after us, and above all, open to none in our absence. Whatever sound you hear, stir not, and look not out. The night will soon fall. This forest is most wild and lonely. Strange noises are often heard therein after sunset. Wolves haunt these glades, and Danish warriors infest the country. Worse things are talked of. You might chance to hear, as it were, a child cry, and on opening the door to afford it succor, a great black bull, or a shadowy goblin dog might rush over the threshold, or more awful still, if something flapped as with wings against the lattice, and then a raven or a white dove flew in and settled on the hearth. Such a visitor would be a sure sign of misfortune to the house. Therefore heed my advice, and lift the latchet for nothing." Her husband calls her away. Both depart. The stranger, left alone, listens a while to the muffled snow wind, the remote swollen sound of the river, and then he speaks. "It is Christmas Eve," says he. "I mark the date. Here I sit alone on a rude couch of rushes, sheltered by the thatch of a herdsman's hut. I, whose inheritance was a kingdom, owe my night's harbourage to a poor serf. My throne is usurped. My crown presses the brow of an invader. I have no friends. My troops wander broken in the hills of Wales. Reckless robbers spoil my country. My subjects lie prostrate, their breasts crushed by the heel of the brutal Dane. Fate, thou hast done thy worst, and now thou standest before me, resting thy hand on thy blunted blade. Aye, I see thine eye confront mine, and demand why I still live, why I still hope. Pagan demon, I credit not thine omnipotence, and so cannot succumb to thy power. My God, whose Son, as on this night took on him the form of man, and for whom man vouchsafed to suffer and bleed, controls thy hand, and without his behest thou canst not strike a stroke. My God is sinless, eternal, all-wise. In him is my trust, and though stripped and crushed by thee, though naked, desolate, void of resource, I do not despair, I cannot despair. Were the lance of Guthrum now wet with my blood, I should not despair. I watch, I toil, I hope, I pray. Jehovah in his own time will aid." I need not continue the quotation. The whole devoir was in the same strain. There were errors of orthography, there were foreign idioms, there were some faults of construction, there were verbs irregular transformed into verbs regular. It was mostly made up, as the above example shows, of short and somewhat rude sentences, and the style stood in great need of polish and sustained dignity. Yet such as it was, I had hitherto seen nothing like it in the course of my professorial experience. The girl's mind had conceived a picture of the hut, of the two peasants, of the crownless king. She had imagined the wintry forest. She had recalled the old Saxon ghost legends. She had appreciated Alfred's courage under calamity. She had remembered his Christian education, and had shown him, with the rooted confidence of those primitive days, relying on the scriptural Jehovah for aid against the mythological destiny. This she had done without a hint from me. I had given the subject, but not said a word about the manner of treating it. I will find or make an opportunity of speaking to her, I said to myself as I rolled the devoir up. I will learn what she has of English in her besides the name of Frances Evans. She is no novice in the language, that is evident, yet she told me she had neither been in England, nor taken lessons in English, nor lived in English families. In the course of my next lesson, I made a report of the other devoirs, dealing out praise and blame in very small retail parcels, according to my custom, for there was no use in blaming severely, and high encomiums were rarely merited. I said nothing of Mademoiselle Henri's exercise, and, spectacles on nose, I endeavoured to decipher in her countenance her sentiments at the omission. I wanted to find out whether in her existed a consciousness of her own talents. If she thinks she did a clever thing in composing that devoir, she will now look mortified, thought I. Grave as usual, almost sombre, was her face. As usual, her eyes were fastened on the cahier open before her. There was something, I thought, of expectation in her attitude. As I concluded a brief review of the last devoir, and when, casting it from me and rubbing my hands, I bade them take their grammars, some slight change did pass over her air and mien, as though she now relinquished a faint prospect of pleasant excitement. She had been waiting for something to be discussed in which she had a degree of interest. The discussion was not to come on, so expectation sank back, shrunk and sad, but attention, promptly filling up the void, repaired in a moment the transient collapse of feature. Still I felt, rather than saw, during the whole course of the lesson, that a hope had been wrenched from her, and that if she did not show distress, it was because she would not. At 4 o'clock, when the bell rang and the room was in immediate tumult, instead of taking my hat and starting from the estrade, I sat still a moment. I looked at Frances. She was putting her books into her cabas. Having fastened the button, she raised her head. Encountering my eye, she made a quiet, respectful obeisance, as bidding good afternoon, and was turning to depart. "Come here," said I, lifting my finger at the same time. She hesitated. She could not hear the words amidst the uproar now pervading both schoolrooms. I repeated the sign. She approached. Again she paused within a half-yard of the estrade, and, looking shy, and still doubtful whether she had mistaken my meaning. "Step up," I said, speaking with decision. It is the only way of dealing with diffident, easily embarrassed characters, and with some slight manual aid, I presently got her placed just where I wanted her to be, that is, between my desk and the window, where she was screened from the rush of the second division, and where no one could sneak behind her to listen. "Take a seat," I said, placing a tabouret, and I made her sit down. I knew what I was doing would be considered a very strange thing, and, what was more, I did not care. Frances knew it also, and I fear, by an appearance of agitation and trembling, that she cared much. I drew from my pocket the rolled-up devoir. "This is yours, I suppose?" said I, addressing her in English, for I now felt sure she could speak English. "Yes," she answered distinctly, and as I unrolled it and laid it out flat on the desk before her with my hand upon it and a pencil in that hand, I saw her moved and, as it were, kindled. Her depression beamed as a cloud might behind which the sun is burning. "This devoir has numerous faults," said I. "It will take you some years of careful study before you are in a condition to write English with absolute correctness. Attend. I will point out some principal defects." And I went through it carefully, noting every error, and demonstrating why they were errors, and how the words or phrases ought to have been written. In the course of this sobering process she became calm. I now went on. "As to the substance of your devoir, Mademoiselle Henri, it has surprised me. I perused it with pleasure because I saw in it some proofs of taste and fancy. Taste and fancy are not the highest gifts of the human mind, but such as they are, you possess them, not probably in a paramount degree, but in a degree beyond what the majority can boast. You may then take courage, cultivate the faculties that God and nature have bestowed on you, and do not fear in any crisis of suffering, under any pressure of injustice, to derive free and full consolation from the consciousness of their strength and rarity." Strength and rarity, I repeated to myself. Aye, the words are probably true, for on looking up, I saw the sun had dissevered its screening cloud. Her countenance was transfigured. A smile shone in her eyes, a smile almost triumphant. It seemed to say, "I am glad you have been forced to discover so much of my nature. You need not so carefully moderate your language. Do you think I am myself a stranger to myself? What you tell me in terms so qualified, I have known fully from a child." She did say this as plainly as a frank and flashing glance could, but in a moment. The glow of her complexion, the radiance of her aspect, had subsided. If strongly conscious of her talents, she was equally conscious of her harassing defects, and the remembrance of these, obliterated for a single second, now reviving with sudden force, at once subdued the two vivid characters in which her sense of her powers had been expressed. So quick was the revulsion of feeling, I had not time to check her triumph by reproof. Ere I could contract my brows to a frown, she had become serious and almost mournful-looking. "Thank you, sir," said she, rising. There was gratitude both in her voice and in the look which she accompanied it. It was time indeed for our conference to terminate, for, when I glanced round behind all the boarders, the day scholars had departed, were congregated within a yard or two of my desk, and stood staring with eyes and mouths wide open. The three maitresses formed a whispering knot in one corner, and close at my elbow was the directress, sitting on a low chair, calmly clipping the tassels of her finished purse. The end of Chapter 16. Read by Rick Kishner for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 17. After all, I had profited but imperfectly by the opportunity I had so boldly achieved of speaking to Mademoiselle Henri. It was my intention to ask her how she came to be possessed of 2 English baptismal names, Francis and Evans, in addition to her French surname, also whence she derived her good accent. I had forgotten both points, or rather our colloquy had been so brief that I had not had time to bring them forward. Moreover, I had not half tested her powers of speaking English. All I had drawn from her in that language were the words, "Yes," and "Thank you, sir." No matter, I reflected. What has been left incomplete now shall be finished another day. Nor did I fail to keep the promise thus made to myself. It was difficult to get even a few words of particular conversation with one pupil among so many, but, according to the old proverb, where there is a will, there is a way. And again I managed to find an opportunity for exchanging a few words with Mademoiselle Henri, regardless that envy stared and detraction whispered whenever I approached her. "Your book an instant." Such was the mode in which I often began these brief dialogues. The time was always just at the conclusion of the lesson, and motioning to her to rise, I installed myself in her place, allowing her to stand deferentially at my side, for I esteemed it wise and right in her case to enforce strictly all forms ordinarily in use between master and pupil, the rather because I perceived that in proportion as my manner grew austere and magisterial, hers became easy and self-possessed, an odd contradiction doubtless to the ordinary effect in such cases, but so it was. "A pencil," said I, holding out my hand without looking at her. I am now about to sketch a brief report of the first of these conferences. She gave me one, and while I underlined some errors in a grammatical exercise she had written, I observed, "You are not a native of Belgium?" "No." "Nor of France?" "No." "Where, then, is your birthplace?" "I was born at Geneva." "You don't call Francis and Evans Swiss names, I presume?" "No, sir. They are English names." "Just so. And is it the custom of the Genevese to give their children English appellatives?" "Non, monsieur, mais—" "Speak English, if you please." "Mais—" "English? But—" slowly, and with embarrassment, "my parents were not all the 2 Genevese." "Say both instead of all the 2, mademoiselle." "Not both Swiss. My mother was English." "Ah. And of English extraction?" "Yes, her ancestors were all English." "And your father?" "He was Swiss." "What besides?" "What was his profession?" "Ecclesiastic. Pastor. He had a church." "Since your mother is an Englishwoman, why do you not speak English with more facility?" "Maman est morte. Il y a 10 ans." "And you do homage to her memory by forgetting her language. Have the goodness to put French out of your mind so long as I converse with you. Keep to English." "C'est si difficile, monsieur, quand on n'a plus l'habitude." "You had the habitude formerly, I suppose. Now answer me in your mother tongue." "Yes, sir. I spoke the English more than the French when I was a child." "Why do you not speak it now?" "Because I have no English friends." "You live with your father, I suppose?" "My father is dead." "You have brothers and sisters?" "Not one." "Do you live alone?" "No, I have an aunt, ma tante Juliane." "Your father's sister?" "Justement, monsieur." "Is that English?" "No, but I forget—" "For which, mademoiselle, if you were a child, I should certainly devise some slight punishment. At your age, you must be 2 or 3 and 20, I should think." "Pas encore, monsieur. Ayant mos j'aurai 19 ans." "Well, 19 is a mature age, and having attained it, you ought to be so solicitous for your own improvement that it should not be needful for a master to remind you twice of the expediency of your speaking English whenever practicable." To this wise speech I received no answer, and, When I looked up, my pupil was smiling to herself a much-meaning, though not very gay smile. It seemed to say, "He talks of he knows not what." It said this so plainly that I determined to request information on the point concerning which my ignorance seemed to be thus tacitly affirmed. "Are you solicitous for your own improvement?" "Rather." "How do you provide it, mademoiselle?" An odd question, and bluntly put. It excited a second smile. "Why, monsieur, I am not inattentive, am I? I learn my lessons well." "Oh, a child can do that. And what more do you do?" "What more can I do?" "Oh, certainly not much, but you are a teacher, are you not, as well as a pupil?" "Yes." "You teach lace-mending?" "Yes." "A dull, stupid occupation. Do you like it?" "No. It is tedious." "Why do you pursue it? Why do you not rather teach history, geography, grammar, even arithmetic?" "Is monsieur certain that I am myself thoroughly acquainted with these studies?" "I don't know. You ought to be at your age." "But I never was at school, monsieur." "Indeed? What then were your friends? What was your aunt about? She is very much to blame." "No, monsieur, no. My aunt is good. She is not to blame. She does what she can. She lodges and nourishes me." I report Mademoiselle Henri's phrases literally, and it was thus she translated from the French. "She is not rich. She has only an annuity of 1,200 francs, and it would be impossible for her to send me to school." "Rather," thought I to myself on hearing this, but I continued in the dogmatical tone I had adopted. "It is sad, however, that you should be brought up in ignorance of the most ordinary branches of education. Had you known something of history and grammar, you might by degrees have relinquished your lace-mending drudgery and risen in the world." "It is what I mean to do." "How? By a knowledge of English alone? That will not suffice. No respectable family will receive a governess whose whole stock of knowledge consists in a familiarity with one foreign language." "Monsieur, I know other things." Yes, you can work with Berlin wools and embroider handkerchiefs and collars. That will do little for you." Mademoiselle Henri's lips were unclosed to answer, but she checked herself, as thinking the discussion had been sufficiently pursued, and remained silent. "Speak," I continued impatiently. "I never like the appearance of acquiescence when the reality is not there, and you had a contradiction at your tongue's end." "Monsieur, I have had many lessons both in grammar, history, geography, and arithmetic. I have gone through a course of each study." "Bravo! But how did you manage it, since your aunt could not afford to send you to school?" "By lace-mending, by the thing monsieur despises so much." "Truly. And now, mademoiselle, it will be a good exercise for you to explain to me in English how such a result was produced by such means." "Monsieur, I begged my aunt to have me taught lace-mending soon after we came to Brussels, because I knew it was a métier, a trade which was easily learnt, and by which I could earn some money very soon. I learnt it in a few days, and I quickly got work, for all the Brussels ladies have old lace, very precious, which must be mended all the times it is washed. I earned money a little, and this money I gave for lessons in the studies I have mentioned. Some of it I spent in buying books, English books especially. Soon I shall try to find a place of governess or school-teacher where I can write and speak English well, but it will be difficult, because those who know I have been a lace-mender will despise me as the pupils here despise me. Pourtant, j'aime mon projet," she added in a lower tone. "What is it?" "I will go and live in England. I will teach French there." The words were pronounced emphatically. She said England, as you might suppose an Israelite of Moses' day would have said Canaan. "Have you a wish to see England?" "Yes, and an intention." And here a voice, the voice of the directress, interposed. "Mademoiselle Henri, je crois qu'il a pleuvoir. Vous feriez bien, mon bon ami, de retourner chez vous tout de suite." In silence, without a word of thanks for this officious warning, Mademoiselle Henri collected her books. She moved to me respectfully, endeavoured to move to her superior, though the endeavour was almost a failure, for her head seemed as if it would not bend, and thus departed. Where there is one grain of perseverance or wilfulness in the composition, trifling obstacles are ever known to stimulate rather than discourage. Mademoiselle Routier might as well have spared herself the trouble of giving that intimation about the weather. By the by, her prediction was falsified by the event. It did not rain that evening. At the close of the next lesson, I was again at Mademoiselle Henri's desk. Thus did I accost her. "What is your idea of England, mademoiselle? Why do you wish to go there?" Accustomed by this time to the calculated abruptness of my manner, it no longer discomposed or surprised her, and she answered with only so much of hesitation as was rendered inevitable by the difficulty she experienced in improvising the translation of her thoughts from French to English. "England is something unique, as I have heard and read. My idea of it is vague, and I want to go there to render my idea clear, definite." How much of England do you suppose you could see if you went there in the capacity of a teacher? A strange notion you must have of getting a clear and definite idea of a country. All you could see of Great Britain would be the interior of a school, or at most of one or two private dwellings. It would be an English school. They would be English dwellings. Indisputably, but what then? What would be the value of observations made on a scale so narrow? Monsieur, might not one learn something by analogy? An enchantillon, a sample, often serves to give an idea of the whole. Besides, narrow and wide are words comparative, are they not? All my life would perhaps seem narrow in your eyes, all the life of that little animal subterranean, un tapet. Comment dit-on? Mole. Yes, a mole which lives underground would seem narrow even to me. Well, mademoiselle, what then? Proceed. Mais monsieur, vous me comprenez? Not in the least. Have the goodness to explain. Why, monsieur, it is just so. In Switzerland I have done but little, learnt but little, and seen but little. My life there was in a circle. I walked the same round every day. I could not get out of it. Had I rested, remained there even till my death, I should never have enlarged it, because I am poor and not skilful. I have not great acquirements. When I was quite tired of this round, I begged my aunt to go to Brussels. My existence is no larger here, because I am no richer or higher. I walk in as narrow a limit, but the scene is changed. It would change again if I went to England. I knew something of the bourgeois of Geneva. Now I know something of the bourgeois of Brussels. If I went to London, I would know something of the bourgeois of London. Can you make any sense out of what I say, monsieur, or is it all obscure? I see. Now let us advert to another subject. You propose to devote your life to teaching, and you are a most unsuccessful teacher. You cannot keep your pupils in order. A flush of painful confusion was the result of this harsh remark. She bent her head to the desk, but soon, raising it, replied, "Monsieur, I am not a skilful teacher, it is true, but practice improves. Besides, I work under difficulties. Here I only teach sewing. I can show no power in sewing, no superiority. It is a subordinate art. Then I have no associates in this house. I am isolated. I am too a heretic, which deprives me of influence." "And in England you would be a foreigner. That too would deprive you of influence, and would effectually separate you from all round you. In England you would have as few connections, as little importance as you have here." "But I should be learning something. For the rest, there are probably difficulties for such as I everywhere, and if I must contend, and perhaps be conquered, I would rather submit to English pride than to Flemish coarseness. Besides, monsieur—" She stopped, not evidently from any difficulty in finding words to express herself, but because discretion seemed to say, "You have said enough." "Finish your phrase," I urged. "Besides, monsieur, I long to live once more among Protestants. They are more honest than Catholics. A Romish school is a building with porous walls, a hollow floor, a false ceiling. Every room in this house, monsieur, has eye-holes and ear-holes, and what the house is, the inhabitants are very treacherous. They all think it lawful to tell lies. They all call it politeness to profess friendship where they feel hatred." "All?" said I. "You mean the pupils, the mere children, inexperienced, giddy things who have not yet learnt to distinguish the difference between right and wrong?" "On the contrary, monsieur. The children are the most sincere. They have not yet had time to become accomplished in duplicity. They will tell lies, but they do it inartificially, and you know they are lying. But the grown-up people are very false. They deceive strangers. They deceive each other. A servant here entered. Mademoiselle Henri, Mademoiselle Routier, vous priez de vouloir bien conduire de la petite dans le dos chez elle. Elle vous attend dans le cabinet de Rosalie la portière. C'est que ce bon, n'est-ce pas, venu la chercher, voyez-vous? Eh bien, est-ce que je suis ce bon, moi? Demanded Mademoiselle Henri. Then smiling, with that same bitter, derisive smile I had seen on her lips once before, she hastily rose and made her exit. The end of Chapter 17. Read by Rick Kistner. For Lit to Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.